Don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. In this episode, I spoke with Neal McCluskey, who is the director of the Cato Institute's Center for Educational Freedom. The Cato Institute is a libertarian think tank that works in all kinds of areas, but of course Neal is the head of the work in the education sphere. Most of our conversations centered around school choice and many of the issues that are concerning that, including the spending of public money on religious schools, the constitutionality of such things, and some of the issues surrounding the ideas of abolishing the Federal Department of Education. And we ended our conversation talking about some of the bomb throwers in the polarized world of school choice. If my voice sounds a little different, it's because I'm in a hotel room in Dallas, Texas. I'm here to work with a school on project-based learning, and I was lucky enough to get some of that great Texas barbecue as well. If you're interested in our professional development services, certainly go to wegrowteachers.com, and you can see our services there, our blogs, and this podcast. And you can reach out to me with any questions at drew@thoughtstretchers.org. And now here's my conversation with Neal. I am with Neal McCluskey, who is the director of Cato's Center for Educational Freedom, and we're going to talk about school choice and probably some other things, but as I like to do, Neal, I want to say welcome to the podcast, give you an opportunity to introduce yourself, and we'll get a little background on who you are and your work with Cato, and then flesh out a little bit what Cato does and doesn't do, and maybe some of the misconceptions and so on and so forth. But let's start with you. So welcome, and tell the folks who you are and what you do.
Sure. Thank you for having me on. I am the director of the Center for Educational Freedom at the Cato Institute. Basically, that means I direct the education policy work. There are different areas at Cato where they will also get involved in education, but sometimes from legal standpoints, sometimes from budgetary standpoints, but we're the ones who deal primarily with education policy. I guess the next thing is, if you've got questions particularly about what Cato is, it all depends on how much depth you want to go into all those aspects. The one thing I'd say is that while we certainly work on school choice at the center, which is kind of the central work we do policy work on everything from early childhood to higher ed. I'm happy to talk about any of those things. We're kind of limited, though, in what we do. We typically steer clear of anything like telling people what curriculum to use, or telling institutions, what their speech policy should be, or something like that, at least private institutions. So while we do education policy, there are lots of parts of it that we don't address because our main concern is getting more freedom and more of a free market in education, and there's some things that go beyond that remit. So if it's something we don't touch on, I'll let you know that it's not something that we typically delve into.
Okay, and it would be fair to characterize Cato as a sort of libertarian think tank?
It is definitely a libertarian think tank. It's sometimes helpful if I kind of briefly describe what libertarian means, because It's not really clear to a lot of people. And libertarians, especially in this in the last 10 years or so, lots of different people have been renaming what they are. And some libertarians call themselves classical liberals because libertarian means some things to some people. We used to, 200, 300 years ago, we would have said we were just liberals, but that's taken on a new meaning. So there's kind of a shorthand way you can understand libertarianism. It's simplified, so there are lots of complexities, but basically, if you think of conservatives, the general idea is conservatives want the government out of your economic life, but are okay having it into your private life. Think of issues like gay marriage or things like that. We tend to think of people who are called liberals, but now I think more often call themselves progressives. They tend to say they want government involved in your economic life, but not so much your personal life. So more for regulation of business, not so much of saying what things you should be able to do with your body or something like that. Mm-hmm. And then libertarians, we say, don't want government in any part of your life, for the most part. So we would just assume that the government stay out of your personal and your economic life. So that's basically what libertarianism is. It obviously is more complex than that, but I hope it gives sort of a general conception of what it is.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting to me how you've described some of the shifts that we've experienced, and I don't want to get too deep into the weeds on this, but I'm curious how you think about. I think many people would have, and probably still do, associate a think tank like Cato with the sort of right side of the political spectrum, conservatism. But I'm curious. I mean, again, you've noted there's some significant shifts under our feet in terms of the role of government and those kinds of things. What's your response when people make that association? And maybe a better way to ask that question is, how do you think about conservatism, the current state of, the Republican Party and the right wing, and I guess you can still call it conservatism. I'm not sure. I'd maybe put a capital C on that, not a small c, and how closely aligned or not aligned they are with sort of libertarian values or thinking.
So if you go back to basically the 1950s, I think is where people usually make this connection. Republicans sort of broadly were kind of a fusion of sort of social conservatives and libertarians. And again, these, none of this was perfect. Not everybody always agreed, but that was generally what they were. And people would often say that, Bill Buckley kind of brought these together. They had one very important commonality, which was opposition to communism, which brought them together. And then I think it's fair to say that the economic concerns, regulation of business, government control of industries and things were a bigger matter than cultural issues. Those were there, but they weren't as important. And so for a long time, we had this kind of fusionism. But that, I think, has started to change probably around the time of the election of Donald Trump, although his election in 2016 obviously represented changes already happening. But there's been a change, I think, among conservatives toward more populism, where you used to be conservatives, for instance, were kind of highly suspicious of and in opposition to unions. You see many conservatives and Republicans now saying, actually, unions are good. We should want those. We should make sure they have strength, because we've become, they become more sort of in touch with working people, to use a term that I don't really love, but I mean, that's generally how it's conceived. And so that fusionism has sort of fallen apart. Now libertarians are seen with some suspicion by more and more people who are Republicans and conservatives. So you'd think that, for instance, J.D. Vance has sort of a populist streak, and Trump himself has sort of a populist streak. But if you follow the work of national conservatism or Patrick Deneen, who's kind of one of the major thinkers there's been a clear objection to liberalism, and in particular as seen as libertarianism, where we've said there's just too much focus on the individual, not enough focus on the community, too much focus on business, which many conservatives think have become too quote unquote woke. And so now we're seeing a split, I think, between conservatives and libertarians. That said, on a lot of education issues, especially school choice, conservatives and libertarians are still pretty well aligned in wanting school choice. What you do at public schools, there's maybe more separation. But you could see, for instance, what the heritage education people are doing and what we do. And there's a lot of commonality, although, again, we split on some things, especially when it comes to DEI or other things that conservatives call woke.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and add to that mix, I'm sure you're aware, I think it's the New Hampshire Libertarian Party and the tweets that they've been putting out. I don't remember what they were, but they seem fairly bonkers, and it seems like there's a wing, at least, of the Libertarian Party that has maybe lost the plot or something like that. So how's that affecting your work?
Well, the good news is, so we're libertarian with a small L, and there has never, at least in my observation and my experience, been much connection between libertarians such as you have at Cato or who tend to align at Cato and the Libertarian Party. The Libertarian Party has probably always been very fringe, and the things you see out of the New Hampshire branch in particular, but I think I've seen some others, are not really representative of most small L libertarians, at least that I know or the people that I talk to. And I don't follow big L Libertarian Party matters all that closely, but so I understand that there's been a split there too of some libertarians who are more, more conservative, I think, in their outlook, and libertarians who are, maybe you'd say, more progressive, although that may not be quite the right way to split it. But what happens in the Libertarian Party tends to be not particularly impactful with small L libertarians.
Well, and again, I don't, not certainly intending to get into the weeds here, but it does, I think, help people think about some of the conversation we're going to have, which is, around school choice and maybe, the importance or non-importance of the Department of Education, things like that, things that you and I have tweeted at each other about and quote-unquote argued. When people think about think tanks, whether it's Heritage or Cato or, there's a variety of them out there, of course, AEI, I think the tendency is to try to categorize, right? Try to villainize of us versus them. I think this is a real dynamic that is driving a lot of our polarization, or a function of a lot of our polarization, or maybe both. But when part of that then is to tell the story like, oh, okay, they're a good guy or they're a bad guy. Some of that is around funding. How do you describe the sort of funding sources of Cato? Who are the people that are funding the work of Cato?
Sure. The first thing I'd say is I really don't like the good guy, bad guy dichotomy.
Right, nor do I.
Really think everybody is doing or aiming what they think is right. I first should say is development is not my area, so there may be things I don't know.
Sure.
Cato works somewhat differently than maybe some other think tanks in that, there's institution-wide fundraising and then the departments just get funded. So other places, departments are looking for funding. But to my knowledge, most of the funding comes from individuals. I think, like a lot of places, we are grateful certainly for all our funders. Many of them tend to be people who have been pretty successful financially, but they're not typically corporations or something like that. And it's important for Cato that it's never government, because we're libertarians. It would just be bad for our credibility, if not for our principles, if we took government money. So everything we get is privately funded. We don't ever seek any government funding. And typically it is from individuals who are kind of committed libertarians. I think some of them are conservatives. There could be some progressives too, because again, libertarianism, you mentioned a spectrum, and we all have been taught sort of that there's a political spectrum, except for libertarians. Libertarians actually say it's basically a diamond, and it puts you along different levels of personal freedom and economic freedom. If you ever want to take something called the world's smallest political quiz, I think that's still what it's called, you can find out where you are on that diamond. And so libertarians tend to have a different spectrum than others. And so you can get a bunch of libertarians together and they'll have lots of disagreements. And I think that is probably representative of people who fund Cato as well.
Okay. And to sort of fill in a little bit more about you and your work, what I asked this of quite a few guests, because I think it does help building some context, what was your educational experience like? And even, was it public, private? What was that like, K-12 and then into university? I'm just curious.
Sure. Well, I went to public schools, K through 12, and in suburban New Jersey. I've been to public and private universities. I was at Georgetown undergrad, so that's private. Then Rutgers and George Mason, those are both public. It's hard to equate, what's public versus private experience in K through 12 versus higher ed. I think pretty much all of my experiences were fine. I grew up in a pretty good district. I think the schools were pretty good. I certainly enjoyed Georgetown University. Grad school's a little different because I was working most of the time, but those were fine too. So even though I am for school choice and for markets in education, I don't think that, one sector is particularly tremendous and it's always applicable to every school, and the other sector is always bad and it's always applicable to other schools. But again, higher ed and K-12 are very different kinds of systems. So, which is always an interesting topic if you want to do that.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the school choice kinds of things. I'm in Kentucky, and as you well know, we have an amendment up for, vote here in about a month, and Amendment 2, I think it's called, trying to change the school choice landscape. And, folks who've listened to this podcast or know me would know that I'm an advocate for school choice, but I do have some concerns about some of the things in the movement and some wonders. So just sort of nationally, how do you describe, I guess, what your position is, and I suppose the Cato Institute position on school choice, and why you think it's such an important, mission?
Sure. So fundamentally, and there are lots of different ways to do this, but fundamentally, we're sort of aligned with what Milton Friedman said in the 1950s, which was that he thought it may be a proper role for government to ensure that everybody can get an education. And so that generally translates into funding education. But he thought it didn't make sense that also meant government provided the education. In other words, they didn't just give you money, but they spent it specifically on public schools. And so we generally are in agreement with that idea that if government is going to be involved in funding, and there are arguments whether or not it should be, but we're so far from those that it's sort of irrelevant, but that we think people should be able to choose schools. And there are lots of different vehicles to do that. So it ranges from, most people think of vouchers because they're the most intuitive, where basically the amount of money that would have been spent in a public school is, quote unquote, attached to a kid like a backpack of funding, and they can take it to whatever school they want. But there are also tax credits for individual use. So you use a private school, you can get a tax credit for some amount of the tuition. It could be a scholarship tax credit where individuals or corporations donate to groups that put together scholarships, and then those funders get a credit for that donation. More recently, we have something called education savings accounts that have sort of taken off. Ordinarily, this is state money that goes into basically an account in a child's name, and you can use that money if you want to pay private school tuition. But you can also use it if you want to pay for therapies or tutoring. In other words, the idea is that it's more than just to select a school, it's to select lots of educational options. And then we have a paper that came out probably 10 years or so ago that said, well, really, we'd like a scholarship, a tax credit connected education savings account. Unfortunately, the more things you throw in there, the harder it is to say it all at once. So I never failed to stumble on tax credit connected education savings account. But that would be where you get a tax credit if you donate to groups that put together these savings accounts. And there are reasons that I prefer tax credits to other forms of choice, but that's kind of the gamut. And there are a number of reasons people think this is important. if you go back to the 50s, and school choice debate, by the way, goes back as far as we have public schooling. But if you go back to the 50s, where people tend to draw the modern school choice movement, although it's actually gone in lots of waves since then, a lot of that was about economic efficiency. The idea that, well, if you have competition, you'd get better outcomes because all the schools would be sort of driven to do better. I think a more compelling argument is that when you have lots of different models competing, that helps fuel innovation, and also because kids are different. So one model might not work for another. But as I've done this work for a couple of decades now, I've become convinced that the most important reason for school choice is pluralism. The idea that we have a society of people with diverse values, diverse views of what is proper for to be taught in history or other classes, what is acceptable reading material. And we want a system, especially in a free country, where diverse people with diverse beliefs and values can pursue the education that they think is right. And then we have a society with lots of different approaches to education that are consistent with people's differing values. And I think part of that is also it would lead to more social harmony. This goes back to my hearing a lot that if we had school choice, we'd all be balkanized with a presumption that we'd be at war. I think historically we can look at public schooling and say, actually, that led to a lot of social conflict. So that's kind of what I tend to focus on, although we do work in lots of other aspects of school choice. And now is the time, I'll plug this real fast. We do have something called the Public Schooling Battle Map, which is an online database of values and identity-based conflicts in public schools, really only to illustrate what I used to hear, and don't hear as much anymore, is probably incorrect, which is that public schooling as a system has brought people all together and harmonized us. Whereas I think it's at least as likely that it forces people with different values into conflict with each other, and has done so historically.
Interesting. Well, the pluralism piece is something I certainly want to sort of flesh out a little bit here. The economic efficiency is certainly an argument I've heard many, many times, and people make the analogies of, a restaurant or a grocery store and competition, make either you go out of business or you improve or something like that. It doesn't resonate with me particularly well because while schools are not solely a public good, they have some sort of characteristics of a public good, and they don't have the autonomy and the agility, and maybe there's an argument that they should, to be able to be responsive like a restaurant might be or something like that. I do think the innovation, the competition fuels innovation argument certainly has some more legs, something that resonates somewhat with me. But the pluralism piece is, we actually work with schools on what we call objective pluralism, which is a little bit different than I think what you're talking about, really trying to help them think through some of the culture war issues and, those multiple perspectives and things like that. And I think you're talking probably more a bit about values. And so that brings me to one of my wonders and my concerns, and something that frustrates me in the school choice movement. And again, I'm largely an advocate. My daughters, we exercise school choice within a public school system, and in Kentucky you can go to a neighboring district, or actually I think you can go to any district, but obviously being something 2 hours away would be a little difficult. But the thing that seems to me to be left out of the conversation in most of these conversations is the sort of at least baseline for standards of quality and quality teaching and learning, which then people say, well, you're being paternalistic, right? Or some version of that. But it seems reasonable to me to expect or want to expect from any of our schools, receiving public money, that they would not teach things that are not based in fact or truth. We can get, you can use culture war issues as one piece of that. But what if you had a school that taught that the Earth was 6,000 years old, or some version of that sort of creationist kind of thing? and receiving public money. And to me, that crosses a line that I struggle with. And you might say I'm paternalistic, but it also, you could take it to another example of teaching of reading, right? So are they using balanced literacy, or are they using the science of reading kind of approach to structured literacy? You can debate whether one is better than the other. People are debating that, but there does seem to be better ways of teaching and less better ways of teaching. And so that pluralism, sometimes I wonder about how do we ensure quality in the school choice movement, and not just having a lot of schools, or some schools that are just teaching things that are patently untrue, or using really poor teaching methods.
Yeah, so I don't think of that as paternalistic. I think we need to have a debate about first of all, it'd be a huge improvement, I think, if we have very broad school choice, even with some regulations like that. Although I do worry a lot about over-regulating. And so, while I think that we can have a good discussion about, how do you ensure quality, I think we need to do it from a kind of a realistic standpoint. So, and actually, the baseline needs to be, and this is what concerns me always, is we have a society that is supposed to be grounded in liberty, and that means that the default would be away from government determining what kids will learn. Granted, you can choose private schools now, but you have to pay taxes for public schools. Then if you want something else, you pay twice.
Sure.
That is totally inconsistent with a free society, and I want to get us first and foremost focused on a free society. That means our default should be choice. And then we can discuss aspects of choice and how maybe we could, make sure that it has some sort of guardrails. But I think we run into actually a lot of trouble once we get into the reality of that. And so, again, I'm not an expert in pedagogy, but you mentioned reading. Well, we had widespread adoption for a very long time in public schools of an approach to reading that now people say, well, actually that hasn't worked, and research has shown that hasn't worked for a very long time.
Right.
But it was very popular, or tended to be popular, among educators, and they thought it was the right way to go. And we have to, I think, always keep in mind that what we think is correct, we sometimes find out later is not correct. And one of the ways we find out something's not correct is we allow other approaches to be tried so that we can compare them, and we can compare sort of committed application of those approaches, and hopefully those approaches at scale. I'm always reminded of Horace Mann, who was called the father of the common school. 1837, he becomes the first superintendent of schools in Massachusetts, and he's really kind of like the major thinker and driver and representative for common schooling. But he wrote about how sad and somewhat tragic it is that parents didn't understand the science of phrenology, which is, of course, you can learn things about people by checking the bumps on their head and the shape of their skull, which turned out to be totally false. Now, the problem wasn't that I think Horace Mann was trying to emphasize something false. That seemed to be cutting edge sort of science at the time, but it turned out to be wrong. And so I think one of the other reasons we want the default to be in school choice is if we don't approach things with some humility, thinking they may be wrong, and we say this is definitely right, we could well impose something we think is right, and the smartest people may think is right, that's actually wrong. And the other thing that's important is, so often an objection to school choice is, well, if we allow school choice, there will be people who choose, again, the schools that say the earth is 6,000 years old or something like that. Well, for one thing, for a very long time, that was the norm in public schools because that's what most people believe. And we had big debates about that. Of course, you go back to Scopes Monkey in the 1920s, that was all about, should a state forbid the teaching of evolution? So when we allow government to control the schools, it may well be that they're going to impose things that are wrong. And then there's been research done that shows biology teachers, I think it was only high school biology teachers, I don't think they went into middle schools, done in 2008 by guys at Penn State called Berkman and Plutzer, although I always forget the title of the book, and then I have to look at all my books to remember which one it is. But they found that the large majority of biology teachers either skip or soft pedal evolution because they don't want conflict over it. We see something similar, I think, although I don't think it's been as clearly established when we talk about the teaching of civics. We've certainly seen a lot of polls that say teachers avoid teaching civics in part because they don't want to ignite conflicts. So I think part of what we've done is by saying, well, we have one system for everyone because we don't want somebody to learn something that many people think is wrong. If it's controversial, we pull it out of the curriculum completely, or at least we are very careful and cautious and quiet about it. And so it may be that we're keeping kids of all different backgrounds from getting coherent curriculum because we don't want to start fights among the diverse people who are there. And then there is also, I think, a kind of libertarian approach of, if we think something is wrong, the way to change views on it is not through government, but through persuasion, which of course is hard. And if you're going to have an education system, there's going to be government involvement. You obviously have to deal with that. But I think it's better if we deal with these things through persuasion than we say, okay, you can't get equal treatment by government and funding education if you want to do X, Y, or Z. And it often gets even to murkier things like, well, what do you teach about climate change? Because once you get into something like that, it gets, very dicey.
Yeah. So a couple things that came to mind as you're talking. One, so you're kind of, if I'm characterizing you right, you're sort of advocating for a similar, maybe an analogy to the free speech concept of, we need to allow for a variety of opinions and perspectives because that's how we correct what we believe to be true that then isn't true and that kind of thing. And so using that model to make progress in pedagogy and things like that, allowing for different models. I suppose a question that one would wonder is, to what extent does that have a potentially negative effect on students, and those students who are in the control variable or maybe in the dependent variable, and so reckoning with that, but sort of getting back to the quality and sort of baseline of quality and standards, of which, if I heard you correctly, you said you don't necessarily have a real problem with that. But then if we were to do that, because I know one thing you've been advocating for is an abolishing of the Department of Education, would we want, who would we want to be leading the sort of charge on what quality looks like?
Yeah, so let me say one thing that's important that I don't think comes up enough, but you mentioned that in education we're talking about kids, and I don't think libertarians talk about this enough. We talk about school choice, and there are certainly reasons we want school choice, in particular because of concern of imposing something that's bad on everyone. But education is actually much harder than the libertarian approach to other areas, because usually if we're libertarians, we say, oh, well, drugs should be legal because I, as an adult who is capable of making informed, rational decisions, should be able to decide what I do with my own body.
All right.
It's harder with education because somebody is making decisions for kids.
Right.
So I do think it's important that we don't just say, well, it should be whatever parents want, without considering that important factor. I still say we need to have a heavy bias toward decentralized, family-driven and educator-driven decisions, because a free society also means government isn't making those decisions for everyone else. But it's important that we talk about, well, but what is best for kids? And I'm not sure we always do that. I think libertarians sometimes just say, well, whatever the parents want is probably right for kids. And I tend to think that's a reasonable default, but we should talk more about that. And then I forgot what the second part of your question was, because I wanted to make that point.
Well, if we're going to have some sense of baseline of quality, and the federal government isn't the sort of leading that charge, if you want to abolish the Department of Education, then who would be leading that charge?
Right. So the federal government has almost never led the charge on anything in education. The first reason for that is there is no constitutional authority for the federal government to educate or to govern in education. So, and this may be a particular libertarian perspective, but the Constitution gives the federal government only specific enumerated powers. That is clear in the structure of the Constitution. It's made clear in the Federalist Papers. And it is re-emphasized in the Bill of Rights, saying whatever hasn't been given to the federal government resides with the people or the states. And so the federal government, until about the 1960s, you could say probably the 1950s, because you have the National Defense Education Act after Sputnik, but for the most part, it stayed out of education. It did a little in higher ed too, which we can certainly talk about if you like, but it's not until you get to the War on Poverty in the mid-1960s that the federal government starts to say, you know, we have a role, but that role even then was compensatory funding for low-income districts, basically, and low-income schools. It wasn't an idea that, well, and we should also be driving quality. What you see is from the 60s to around the early to mid 80s, that is the role. But even for much of that time, you had some people saying, well, we spend this money, we should find out if we're getting something for it, or if it's being wasted. And so in the 1980s, a little bit of the timeline, 1979, the U.S. Department of Education is created by law. 1980 is when it actually kicks into action. In 1980, it's also a presidential election. Candidate Reagan says he wants to get rid of the Department of Education. He's elected. He tries to get rid of it in 1981. There's no appetite in Congress to do it, so it stays. But it's probably worth people knowing that the Department of Education is not that old, so 1980. And so, again, you're doing this compensatory funding, but in the early 80s, now that the department stays, in 1983, they commission a report called A Nation at Risk, which famously says that if a foreign power had done to us what we've done to ourselves with our education system, we'd have considered it an act of war. And then you start to have people start to look at the federal government for, and the Reagan Department of Education, somewhat ironically, to say, okay, now we're going to hold schools accountable. They start to post test scores for states. And that eventually morphs into the No Child Left Behind Act. There are a few acts before it that start to ramp up some requirements for testing and that you make some sort of progress on testing. But No Child Left Behind, which passed in 2002, is when we say, okay, all schools must have uniform standards. All states, uniform standards and tests within the state in math and reading and science, but you're only held accountable for math and reading. And that is really the period, and it's a small one, really, when you look at the grand scheme of American history, where the federal government is starting to say, okay, states, you've got to hold schools accountable to math and reading. But even then, for most of that time, the states were the ones who were responsible for their own standards and their own tests. It's only when you get to 2009 and we have the Great Recession and there's the big federal stimulus. Part of that is $4.35 billion that the U.S. Secretary of Education controls that he used for something called Race to the Top, where it said, states, if you want some of this money, you have to adopt standards and tests that are common to a majority of states, knowing that there are only two of these. There's the SBAC and I can't remember the other one. Thankfully, it's been a long time, so I've kind of forgotten what they were. But there are two consortia, basically, that have come up with, there's the Common Core standards, and then two consortia of testing states, and each one has 26 states. I don't know who the state was that's in, maybe many of them were in multiple. But so they essentially coerce adoption of Common Core. So it's standard curricular standards in math and reading with little bits that talk about, oh, here's how you can apply it to social studies and to science, but it's mainly math and reading. And then these tests. And that was as close as we've come to the federal government actually dictating this is what you will use as your measure. But the Obama administration eventually says, and we're going to attach teacher evaluations to how students do on these Common Core standards and tests. And people were already kind of revolting against this standard and test-centric system. In 2014, though, you get these conservatives, small government conservatives, libertarians, progressives, all say they've had it with this. And the No Child Left Behind Act is replaced with the Every Student Succeeds Act. And that gets rid of this linchpin called adequate yearly progress, which is how we held many schools, quote unquote, accountable to it. So the federal government it was a kind of a blip where it was the one saying, well, here's how you will be held accountable. And so the entity that should do it constitutionally, or at least the highest level, if you're in a state, you could debate this, but is the state. The power over education is reserved to states or the people. So if a state wants to say, oh, we're going to go all school choice, they can do that. Most or every state has, though, public education or public schooling, depending on your state and the Constitution. So that's probably the level where the accountability would come from.
Yeah, well, I'm with you on some of that and the limited government and certainly constitutionality of the roles. But it does strike me as at least mildly problematic that it would be left to the states without any sort of leadership. And maybe it's not the federal Department of Education or the commissioner, but some, consortium where the states are coming together to have these conversations, because it seems clear to me that there is and should be some baseline of standard of what we're after. Betsy DeVos, as a Department of Education commissioner, certainly did some things I think were good in terms of Title IX, and we're seeing a reversal of that and the constitutionality of that being wiped out. But I also, felt, for example, that her leadership, and maybe it's just a function of the role and the politics, but during COVID, it seemed like it would have been great to have a stronger voice to say, here's what we want to sort of focus on and use that just as sort of a bully pulpit, and not a bully pulpit, just clarity, so that we can all have a conversation and have that common language or a common goal, common mission. And I think similarly, we would want to have some sort of language or mission that we have in common on pedagogical approaches, right? And what we want as outcomes. Your Nation at Risk, you're bringing that up. I bring that up as what I think is one of the reasons why we are in the position where we are with polarization. I make the argument that in 1983, Nation at Risk comes out and really set us on that sort of path of accountability, high stakes, and changed the nature of what was incentivized in classrooms from one that, while the teaching and pedagogy may not necessarily have been super high level, the teachers who were more willing and able to do more Socratic seminar kinds of approaches, discussion, hearing different opinions, wondering about differing opinions, versus that those teachers were disincentivized, and it was harder to do that kind of teaching because what was incentivized was, what's the answer? How do we improve test scores? And it becomes much more about answers. And that, I think, is part of the reason. So we've had decades of students who now become adults who are either resistant to hearing different opinions or some version of that. And I think that's just a small reason for our polarization. Certainly not the only reason, but I would love to see, and this is our objective pluralism work that I'll plug here, is that how we not just teach about civics, but teach about things in ways that are not only norms of conversation, but a real understanding of and leaning into Enlightenment liberal principles that, especially intellectual liberalism, not necessarily economic liberalism or whatever, but I can go down that rabbit hole for quite some time, and I won't do that. But again, coming to that quality kind of piece and thinking about how we help, if we're going to have school choice, and parents know best, which is something that you sort of referenced, and we wondered, how true is that, right? I would say yes, parents know best for their kids, just as a general principle. We want to lean into that. But are parents as well informed about education and education matters as they should be in order to make those choices in a most informed way? I would say no. And that's where, again, people say, well, you're being paternalistic. And I say, well, maybe, but if we say we want to lean into the expertise of doctors or engineers or whoever, we would also want to lean into the expertise of educators or people who work in that and have those discussions and help parents to make some of those decisions. So how do you respond, or how do you think about the sort of parents know best kind of argument?
Sure. And maybe I'll take two parts of that, because there's sort of the top-down control part and then the parents know best. Mm-hmm. I think your observation on No Child Left Behind, on A Nation at Risk, mm-hmm. which sort of set things in motion to get to the No Child Left Behind Act, was a good example of, I think, well-intentioned. I think almost all these policies are well-intentioned. And the idea was somebody has to hold states accountable for kids' basic skills. But one of the things that we've seen clearly from that is it did end up sort of marginalizing things like civics, mm-hmm. history education. Mm-hmm. There's just a study you may have seen that came out called American Lesson Plan from the American Historical Association.
Haven't seen that one.
Yeah, it was only, I think it came out last week or something, but it was kind of sort of a big analysis of, what happened to civics and history education. And a lot of it is about how those topics have been pushed aside. In part, it's, as I mentioned earlier, that teachers tend to be a little afraid to get into some of the more controversial parts because they don't want to ignite controversy in their schools and in their classrooms. But also they said, part of this was No Child Left Behind, where we put a federally driven obsessive focus on math and reading, and other subjects got kind of pushed to the periphery. And there were teachers who were even saying, it's not like they didn't let us teach history and civics, although we saw evidence that time to those subjects was decreased. But the principal or someone would tell us, but really focus on skills and so reading and writing and things like that in those classes. And many of the teachers said, well, we really need to teach content so people, kids know what's going on, and then they can make informed decisions. And when we have discussions, they mm-hmm. are doing it from a formed basis. So I totally understand the inclination to say we need to have some sort of national baseline of quality. But we also always, when we want government to do something, have to think of unintended consequences. And No Child Left Behind was a powerful lesson in unintended consequences. The other kind of ironic part of that is, I think, the standards and accountability movement, the idea that we should be having a lot of tests in particular subjects to make sure kids are making progress, and then we correct, or whatever term you want to use for the implications for schools, that started out at states, where states are the quote-unquote laboratories of democracy. And I wonder if that movement would have been more sustained, but also probably more nuanced, if it had remained at the state level, where states could continue to use that sort of approach, but they could adjust it as it became popular or unpopular, as they saw parts worked or didn't work, rather than having the federal government now impose it on everyone. And so if you're a school where somebody says, well, you're not doing well enough, it's not the people in your district, it's not your state, it's somebody in Washington saying, you're not doing well enough, and now you have to change how you teach X, Y, and Z, or you have to remove your whole staff, which was kind of one of the things that could happen to mm-hmm. you. And so there are many reasons I think we should not want the federal government to do this. And then that takes you kind of the other side. Okay, so that's the very top. At the bottom, we would say, well, parents making their own decisions. I certainly think that you're right that, parents don't tend to be education experts. I think part of that is because we have long had a default model where you own a home or you rent a home and you're assigned to a school. And that was what happened. And parents didn't have strong reasons to become well informed about education because they didn't have much agency to do anything about it. Yes, you could, if you had means, you could buy a home and you'd look and say, well, what are the test scores in this district versus this district? And you'd buy a home in one that you thought was good, although that often reflected that you were buying a home with wealthy people.
Right.
So what we've seen then is when we've had school choice, over time, the parents eligible for it become more informed consumers. What we saw, for instance, there were studies of the DC voucher program that said at first, what parents tend to look for was, well, I want a school that's safe, which makes sense that, your first concern is, well, I don't want my child getting hurt. But after they had the voucher for a year or two, they started to look for schools and ask, well, what are your test scores? What are your outcomes? That doesn't make them experts, but it suggests that when enabled to be consumers, they become more informed and more active consumers. And I think the doctor analogy is a good one because, we don't expect, I don't go around saying, well, I'm sorry, brain surgeon, but you're doing that wrong because I've never done brain surgery. But we do have the ability to choose our doctors and to get second opinions. And if, the one brain surgeon says X and the other says Y, we can evaluate those things. We may go with Y. If we don't like the bedside manner of our doctor, or we feel like they make us sit in the waiting room for 3 hours, we can choose another doctor. So that's an area where, yes, I'm no expert in that, but I have some agency that holds them accountable for many different things because I can choose something else. And then a lesser analogy, but one I like to use because everybody gets it, and I just bought a new car, is if I know nothing about cars. I mean, I know the steering wheel and I know the wheels on the bottom that make it kind of, hold on to the road, but I'm not an expert in cars. But because I'm a consumer, I can go to lots of places where they will rate cars for me. The experts will, and often they get paid, either in advertisements or subscriptions or both. And so the market incentivizes people who are experts to give me information so that I can be an informed consumer. And I think we'd see more of that in education if we had more school choice. But ultimately, there are going to also be differences about what education is about. Do I want a classical learning school and the focus is not on the math and reading tests? Do I want a forest school where it's on exploration and lots of things like that? And we need to, I think, have more room for those alternate models to exist on a pretty level financial playing field so people can sort of sort and we can see what works better.
Yeah, I would love for the school choice movement and advocates or evangelists to talk about that a bit more and not just lean into the easiness of parents know best. Again, how do we empower parents to better decision making? And as you noted, it tends to be, good test scores, it must be good, right? And that's certainly not an accurate measure or metric of what a good school is. It's correlated, but certainly not a direct correlation. A couple of other questions that I think are interesting in that school choice movement. One is about, I guess it in some ways relates to, does the money belong to the school, or does it belong to the parents or the kid? But the question, I think, or one of the fundamental questions in school choice is about the sort of dilution of resources, right? If you have 100 schools in a county versus 25 schools in a county, are all of those 100 schools well-resourced enough to do the kind of work and do the job that we want them to do? Now, you can argue that the 25 schools are not doing the job. It's certainly something that is a reasonable argument. But without those resources, there's a finite number of resources, right, for public schools that we're talking about. So if we dilute those resources, funding being the main part of that, how do we expect them to do the work that we need them to do and not be under-resourced, I suppose?
Yeah, so it's certainly right that there are finite resources. I think that fundamentally we do need to think about we have debates and assertions of, something is overfunded, something is underfunded. We actually don't know the answer to that unless we have a competitive free market system. In other words, where you actually have to sort of compete on a level basis for people to freely choose whether or not they send their resources to you. I mean, that's basically what prices are. Price tells us, well, collectively, millions and millions of people making their own independent decisions about what their priorities are with the money they have, say, I'll go back to cars. The car is worth $25,000. The pencil's worth $1, because I have to decide what to do with my money, my finite resources, and everybody else has to do the same. So I think we start our discussions about funding and underfunding and the right amount of funding without actually knowing those things. And that ends up being a big issue for courts. That doesn't mean that the schools are overfunded. Sometimes, libertarians, conservatives well, we're spending too much. We don't actually know that. A lot of people on the other side say, well, we're not spending enough. We don't actually know that. So I would say that if we go to a school choice system, one thing we might find is you can provide the education people want for less money. We may also find that you need more money. But that's a good, important signal that people say, well, I really want this model, but it costs a lot. But that would have to start with at least giving people the money and they start to make decisions for themselves about how it's used. So I think that's the first point. And then there is something to be said, and I wouldn't paint myself an expert on this, and I don't think we have definitive answers. But there's lots of debates about what's the right size of a school, what's the right size of a district. I think that what I think I've seen in terms of research tends to be that smaller tends to be better depending on what you're interested in. I think a lot of that also has to do with autonomy. It can be better if it's smaller and the person in charge actually can make a lot of decisions, as opposed to like the principal has to go through a big district, then state, then federal bureaucracy. There's not a lot you can do then. Whereas smaller and you can make quick decisions to better reflect what the people you're serving want, that's more efficient. You may not need as much money for that. School districts, I think about, there's some research that suggests that smaller school districts are more efficient because of something called T-boot choice, where people do choose among public providers of things, and the smaller the provider, the more choice you have without having to leave your geographic area that you want to be in. And you think about, so in many states, I think Kentucky's probably one, you probably have big county level school districts. And the odds are the average parent doesn't know who their school board members are, and it's not somebody they bump into at the grocery store or something like that. In some states, which tend to be better performers, but there are lots of reasons for that. But one of the things we see in like Massachusetts and New Jersey, of course, are wealthy people. That's why I take this with a grain of salt. They also tend to have small sort of municipality-sized school districts. So whatever little town you're in, it's also essentially the school district. And those people tend to know their school board members, and they can more easily hold them accountable because, if nothing else, they actually do run into them a lot. And they say, hey, what's going on with this? It's easier to kind of know what's happening and to feel that you have agency there. So I don't know that small necessarily means less efficient. But I certainly understand the concern that, you can only break stuff up so far before it becomes incredibly inefficient and you can't function. But I don't think we're near that point in school choice. The closest you'd come maybe is Arizona, which has the first truly universal school choice program in which not only does everybody qualify, but they actually can get money. And even there right now, the ESA program is 75,000 students. I think there's more than 1 million in Arizona. So we're not at the point in real world applications where we see so much fragmenting, I think, that you say it's not viable. But again, we're early there too. So,
well, I can imagine being a principal of a public school, and certainly I'm sympathetic to the idea of competition, but there's also, and this is a matter of efficiency, I agree with you as a side note, and that smaller districts tend to be more agile and less bureaucracy. And if you have good leadership, then the outcomes, I think, can be better. I've seen that with my own daughters. They go to a very small school, K-12, all in one building, or now a couple buildings, but essentially that small versus being, like in Jefferson County, Louisville, Kentucky is massive, and you have massive inequities between the schools and layers of bureaucracy. We provide professional development, and we work with all sorts of schools around the world, but we see layers of bureaucracy with large districts that are just obfuscating progress and wasting money and all kinds of things. So that is a side note. But again, so I can imagine being a principal. I would rather not imagine being a principal of a public school. My mom was in that role, tried to get me to do that, and I said absolutely not. But point being that I'm trying to compete. I'm trying to, really improve my school, whether it's a large district, small district. It's still incredibly challenging. You're trying to move, sort of steer a large ship, even in a small school. It's hard to get qualified teachers. It's hard to keep and retain for the variety of reasons that I'm sure you're well aware of. So all of those kinds of things that make it really difficult to sort of compete. And then you say, okay, now you're taking more of my funding. That makes it even more challenging. And so that sort of dynamic as it plays out, while again, I'm sort of sympathetic to the argument of choice and how in a larger scale effect, in a macro sense, it makes some sense, but in a micro sense, I can imagine not only would that be a struggle for that school principal or whoever that school leader is, but also then the downstream effects as it affects those students who stay in that school for whatever reason, whether they're choosing to or their parents are just not active in the choice process or whatever. So that to me is a really difficult and wicked problem of this sort of school choice advocacy.
Right. So it's understandable that people would say, look, I need these resources. What we tend to see is just especially not for profit. So that can apply to private schools or public schools. Entities, they tend to say basically whatever amount of money I had last year is what I need to spend because I'm supposed to spend basically all the money I have, as opposed to an openly profit-seeking entity that says, well, I'm supposed to supply this thing at as low a cost as I can while still bringing customers. That's where the accountability comes from. And then what's left over, it goes to shareholders or the owner or whatever. So you can understand where people running schools say, well, I've spent all this money in the past, and so I need it again this year. I think we always need to look at, well, how has the money been spent? And this clearly varies from district to district and school to school, but you can see public schools, we have some in the DC area, where it seems to be a necessity that every school have a planetarium, that every school have television and radio studios, that there's be a very nice lunch area. And to me, some of those things, while may be useful, are they the best use of money, or should it be used in other ways? So I think it's important that we do kind of face a scarcity, because you have to then make serious decisions about what you spend that money on. And is it really necessary? And if there's another school that doesn't supply those things, but is in demand, it may say, okay, we're not using this money efficiently. I can also understand, though, there are probably schools that don't have all those kinds of bells and whistles. But I haven't heard it as much recently. But it used to be said that, well, what's really needed are smaller class sizes. If you work through the basic math of choice, which again becomes more complicated in real life, but typically school choice is funded with state funding. And so ordinarily a public school gets some amount of funding from the state, some local, and a pretty small amount from the federal government, depending where you are. But usually 5 to 13%, depending on the school, is federal. The rest is kind of split half and half between state and local, again, depending on where you are. But if it's only the state money following the student to a chosen school, what they didn't get, especially local money, stays. basically that means there's more money to educate those students who remain. That means you can put more of your resources into that child who's there. This is probably one of the reasons that what we have seen repeatedly, and probably in the research, it's the most common finding and most replicated finding, is that public schools, the more public schools face private competition, the better those schools do. Not a huge amount, but typically it's almost always found that they do better because of that competition. So I understand why, if you're running a school, like, I can't afford to lose any of this money, but that competition does have, it appears, some upward driving force. It may be because it says, well, we've got to work more efficiently. It may be because it leaves more resources with the kids who are not choosing. Maybe it's a combination of both. But I don't think we see in reality this sort of crumbling of public schools as a result of money being able to go somewhere else. It looks like it tends to have positive impacts, again, noting that school choice generally isn't huge right now. So it may change when it gets big, but this is what we've seen so far.
So that maybe is a good segue to a question about the advocacy, the sort of anti-school choice advocacy. I'm sure you're familiar with Josh Cowan and his work. I'm in the middle of his book for a likely podcast with him. And as I'm reading it, one of the things that seems to be, I'm early in the book, I don't know if you've read it yet, but it seems to paint a pretty negative picture of folks like Betsy DeVos and Milton Friedman. So there's, I think, a couple of things here that, one, which is about the currently sort of phrased as trying to destroy public schools sort of narrative. But as I'm understanding it, that, historically, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm early in the book and I need to collect my thoughts on it a little bit better, but I think, if I'm remembering correctly, that Friedman, the sort of thesis is that Friedman and that group was essentially arguing against government-funded public schools. And so then, if that's the case, then it seems reasonable that the sort of destroy public schools narrative maybe makes some sense from the school choice advocacy side, from that sort of area, Betsy DeVos and all of that. The other question there that I have, and this is something that I really struggle with in terms of limiting principles, is how do we keep the line of separation church and state, that kind of thing, and make sure that we're observing that separation of church and state and funding of religious institutions. And I know that we do fund some religious institutions. There's some examples of that, and okay, that makes some sense. So if we fund some of them, why not all of them or some version of that? But then you see and realize that folks like, what's his name, Ryan Walters, the Oklahoma state superintendent, who seems to be overtly campaigning. I mean, it seems wild to me. Some of the stuff I'm sure is mischaracterized, but really it's just almost like, let's instill Christian nationalism in our I guess public schools or whatever that might be. So yeah, how do you think about those two things? To the extent that you want to comment on Josh Cowan's work and that sort of anti-school choice advocacy, I'm curious about that, and then the sort of separation church and state kinds of things that I would assume libertarians would be concerned about as well.
Yeah, so I have read the book. I read it last week. It's not too hard, 150 pages or something. I'll talk a little bit about the book, but actually the questions you ask kind of address a lot of what he says in the book. Let me start with the church-state issue, because I think that is important. And certainly one of his concerns is that school choice is an effort to have Christian nationalism. And he links it, as many people have, understandably, to also people like Ryan Walters and efforts to get religion in public schools. But these are two very different things. And choice, I think, is part of the key of not getting religion in public schools. So understand first, school choice has been found constitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court, first in Zelman v. Simmons Harris in 2002. And the reason, and this is crucial, is that the money doesn't go from government directly to a private school or to a religious school in particular in this case. It goes to parents. And parents then choose among all sorts of different schools, religious, not religious. So that includes, remember, public schools are part of this. You're choosing, do I want to go to the Catholic school? Do I want to go to the traditional public school? In many cases, do I want to go to the charter school? Do I want to go to the art school? And so that is neutral with regard to religion because it is up to the free choice of the parents. What wasn't neutral was to say everybody must pay for public schools, and if you want religious education, you pay on top of that. And it's crucial we remember the history. And one of the problems I have with the Cowan book is it doesn't give you the history until 1955, which is when Friedman writes his chapter in Robert Solo's book where he proposes his school choice program, which is not new. That idea, you can go back all the way to Thomas Paine talked about funding basically students, not the schools. But for most of the history of public schools, they were de facto Protestant institutions. And again, all these things I say in generalities, if you were in one town versus another, you may not have found that. But generally speaking, the expectations, they would be religious. Horace Mann himself said, of course, the Bible would be part of the public schools because that is the expositor of religion that we all agree upon. And so for most of our history, there wasn't church-state separation. They were Protestant. That's why one of the first major ongoing battles for school choice, essentially to fund other types of schools, were for Catholics. I mean, you go back to the 1840s, and in New York, you have big battles over this. And none of that is in the book. And I think that's very important to understand the whole history. And that basically to the 1960s, public schools were de facto religious private or public or de facto religious, generally Protestant schools, because they were still allowed to have prayer, Protestant prayer, reading from the Bible. And it's the Supreme Court rules in the early 1960s, eventually, that prayer and Bible reading officially in the schools is not allowed. But that's a very long time. And you can see what happens then is people who are religious say, but wait a minute, I want the public schools to teach things that I think are important for my kids. And you can understand then why there are some conservatives who say, wait a minute, you've turned the schools into secular institutions. Some conservatives also think not just secular, but kind of aggressively secular and aggressively anti-religious. And somebody like Ryan Walters is saying, you know what, we've pushed religion too far to the margins. We're going to have Bible in the curriculum because we don't want people to forget about the Bible, usually officially couched not as religion, but as knowing your history and American culture and American institutions. Similar in Louisiana, where the government, they just passed, the governor signed a law saying you will post the 10 Commandments in all classrooms, or at least all schools. Can't remember, it's every classroom. With the idea, or at least the argument being, not that we're trying to inculcate religion, but we got to remember where our laws come from, things like that. They may well also want to inculcate religion. We never know motives for sure. But so part of what we're seeing is conservatives saying, I got to pay for this system. Why can't I get out of it what I want? Well, school choice is actually the way to preserve not just church-state separation, but equality, where we don't say the government puts its thumb on the scale for or against religion. We say people choose religion or something that's not religious equally, because they all control where that money for their child's education can go. And I think that's really important. School choice, at least logically, is not a way to achieve Christian nationalism unless you think allowing people on a more equal financial basis to choose a religious school or Christian school constitutes Christian nationalism. And of course, a lot of the growth we've seen in private schools have been things like Jewish day schools. So it's not even just Christian. So I think that that's really important. In terms of destroying public schools, I don't think anybody's intention is to destroy public schools. But I would certainly say for myself, my goal is for everyone to have the ability to choose on a level financial playing field, because that, I think, is how a free pluralist society should work. And that may mean lots of people choose something other than public schools, and that is okay with me. Again, I'm not at war with public schools, but I think we want a system that is more consistent with freedom, and that means people deciding for themselves how that money's used, and educators with much more autonomy to decide, hey, I want to do a school that does X, Y, or Z. And if people want that, then they should be able to choose me. So yes, I want much more freedom in education, but it's not like it's from animosity toward public schooling. It's because there's something I think is better.
So there's lots of questions I would love to ask. I want to be mindful of your time, and certainly one big question that I want, but I'd like to follow up just for some clarity. So again, one of my concerns has been, and I've tried to articulate it, and some of my discussions with people who are, school choice advocates, especially here in Kentucky, vouchers being something that gets thrown around, and technically it's not vouchers, but that vouchers may be one of those things, and we can argue whether they're vouchers or not, but that separation. So if I'm hearing you right, you're saying I shouldn't be particularly concerned about that issue of public money going to, a Catholic school system in Louisville, not just because it may be a parent choice kind of thing, but because it's constitutionally okay in your mind because it's money going to the parents who are then choosing. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, my argument doesn't come down to it being constitutional. I mentioned constitutionality because this is something that's been litigated for the last, more than 20 years. And the courts have said the key to constitutionality, to saying we're not violating the First Amendment, is that the money goes to private schools by free choice of families. And that's very important. And it's distinct from, I think, what's conflated, understandably, because sometimes you have the same people both in favor of choice and putting things into public schools. Choice is different from if Ryan Walters says, well, we're going to have Bible reading in every public classroom. That is much more along the lines of a violation that is, I think, actually a violation of church and state, although you can again go to Supreme Court precedent that says, well, if it's for an educational purpose, not a devotional religious purpose, it's okay. That's a much bigger danger of violating the separation of church and state. I think that school choice is actually the key to not violating the separation of church and state, and more importantly, not discriminating against religious people. So, because the purpose of the First Amendment is to neither elevate nor marginalize religion. It's to make it so that the state isn't influencing it one way or the other. And I think choice does that. And I actually think the absence of choice makes it more imperative for people who say, well, I've got to have religion in my kids' education, to start going to the public school and saying, well, you got to put it in here because otherwise they're not getting what we think is important. And I think it's crucial that people understand the history of public schools, because for most of that history, it was assumed that religion, and particularly a sort of lowest common denominator Protestant form of Christianity, would be a part of public schooling. It's only relatively recently where we said, well, public schooling should be something that has no religion at all. But I'm not saying the reason you should be for more freedom in education is because of the Constitution. But when we talk about church-state separation, it's crucial to understand what the Constitution allows and doesn't allow. Where it gets interesting is, you may have heard about also in Oklahoma, they were going to allow funding to follow somebody to a Catholic cyber school, online charter school. Then you get into an interesting gray area, because a charter school is technically a public school. It has to be approved by some government entity, could be a district, could be a state, depending where you are, to exist. And in Oklahoma law, it says this is a public school. And people have said, well, but it's not fair that you could have a charter school that does basically anything without saying you're violating the Constitution, except be religious. That discriminates against religious people. And so they originally said, we're going to fund this Catholic charter school. And then it was struck down by the state Supreme Court. I think the expectation is it'll be appealed to the Supreme Court. It may already have been appealed. I don't know whether they'll take it up. But that's where you get into an interesting gray area of, well, this is a public school, isn't it? And isn't it kind of actually discrimination against religious people if you say you could essentially have any charter school except religious?
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out here in Kentucky, because as I'm sure you're aware, at least as I understand it, when it came to the Kentucky Supreme Court school choice last time around, it was actually they had the public hearing here in my hometown, and it seems pretty clear to me that they rejected it in large part because of what they perceive as money flowing to religious institutions. But I think it's Indiana, they have basically green-lighted it in other places as well. And I guess from my perspective, I don't want my money nor my students to be in a school that is preaching, social justice orthodoxy any more than I want, Christian nationalist or Jewish or whatever the sort of religious doctrine kinds of things. And but it's interesting the way that you framed it, and that gives me some things to think about. Again, I'm mindful of your time. One thing that I'm curious about how you think about what I see in the school choice movement, and I've talked with a number of people on both sides of the issue. Some of them I think are, I guess, for lack of a better word, to me, making the situation worse in some ways. The sort of flamethrowers, the bomb throwers, or even, Trump talking about the way that he talks about, I'm going to abolish the Department of Education, which I know you're in favor of, but probably not for necessarily the same reasons as Donald Trump, for whatever reasons he has, and those are always somewhat slippery and elusive, what his justifications and motivations might be. But how do you think about some of those sort of flamethrowers and bomb throwers? And some of them I know you have some association with, like Corey DeAngelis. Corey was on my podcast in 2019. Of course, he's run into some interesting waters recently with some things about his past coming up, and so feel free to comment on any of that. But just these bomb throws, and I would say Josh Cohen is probably in some ways a version of that, right? I see his Twitter account, and Randy Weingarten, or the teachers unions, and even some of the legislators on the Democratic side that to the extent that they talk about education, which is usually just very broad strokes and with limited knowledge, and we can talk more about that for probably another day. But kind of how do you think about the state of the conversation and how we move this forward? And just a last piece, like I talked with Shaka Mitchell from the American Federation for Children back in May, and we talked about this as well. He seemed very reasonable, measured, and had some of those same kinds of concerns as well. It doesn't seem to me, people will say somebody like Corey is the most effective agent working in the school choice movement, and I suppose I can see what they're saying, but it also seems like it's also inflaming things to he and folks like him are inflaming things in ways that make the conversation harder, just like everything in our polarization, us versus them sort of culture. So to the extent that you want to comment on any of that, I'm curious.
Sure. Let me take the concern about your money going to schools you don't like first, because I think that's important. Then I'll get to the bomb throwers, which I don't really like to talk about the bomb throwers, but it is important as part of the debate. The one thing I'd mention, because I also mentioned it earlier about, I prefer tax credits to vouchers. Mm-hmm. So one of the concerns about vouchers is what you expressed, which is, you pay taxes, and a voucher, you give it to somebody, and they may take it to a school that teaches things you find abhorrent. Mm-hmm. It may just teach math poorly. And we would like, or at least I would like, to have the people who fund school choice have more agency than they do with vouchers. So tax credits of different types have sort of evolved as school choice has evolved. And again, basically the tax credit is, look, if you choose a private school, you can get some level of tax credit for your tuition. Then you're not compelling anybody else to pay for it. You're just saying, hey, I don't want to pay twice. Once for public schools I don't use, and the second time for the school I want. The same thing applies to a donation credit. First, you have agency in whether or not you choose to donate to a scholarship granting organization. And if you don't think they're going to go to good schools, you don't do that. And that just means even a taxpayer doesn't have kids, they're not paying twice. Once in taxes for public schools they would rather kids not go to, and then a second time if they want to help a child. And that's really important. And in many states where they have scholarship tax credit programs, you can actually choose types of schools you want to go to, or specific schools. It could be Montessori schools, Catholic schools, Baptist schools, art schools, whatever it is. And then it's sort of double freedom for donors, for funders, and that they can choose whether they donate and to whom. So that's one of the reasons I think that scholarship tax credits or tax credits are a better approach than vouchers. But I'd also say for vouchers, so if families with kids have around the same sort of beliefs and value, the same distribution of beliefs and values and desires for math instruction as the general population, you would see that what they'd choose would be roughly representative of what taxpayers broadly would choose if it was up to them. So I certainly understand the concern of I don't want any of my money going to a school I think is teaching bad things. But I think what we'd find is there are probably some others say, well, maybe that's not so bad and I would fund it. And so it may sort of sift out that way, but it's kind of indirect, and the tax credit enables you to more directly decide who you think is worthy of your money. So it's worth drawing that distinction.
Okay.
For in terms of bomb throwers, sort of two things on this. I don't like bomb throwing. I try to avoid bomb throwing. I think what I try to do, which I hope most people will do, is to focus on ideas and not people. I don't, it could be Randy Weingarten, it could be, Corey DeAngelis, it could be Josh Cowan, it could be anybody. I don't like when we say, well, you are the problem, as opposed to I disagree with your ideas. And too much of what I think I see on Twitter is attacking people and not just not attacking or addressing their ideas, but, not reasonably addressing their ideas. We don't seem to approach this with the underlying assumption that I may disagree with this person, but they probably are asking for something that they think is better than what I think. And that their motives are probably good. Maybe they have bad motives, but we don't know that anyway. And so I try to approach all this with the assumption that people are trying to get what they think is right, that they're probably no more nor less evil than anybody else, and we just disagree, and that we accomplish nothing by attacking people instead of addressing their ideas. However, what seems to unfortunately be the reality is if you want political change, and if you want attention, like on social media, people seem to really like fights, and they really seem to like people demeaning each other, and they like, there's always this idea that you have to have an enemy, and this is how you energize people. If you go back to Culture War, the book from 1990, it's, before social media, but a big thing of what it says is, well, why do we see these culture wars over values in particular, which is what I'm interested in more than anything else? And they say, well, because values mean a lot to people emotionally, and then the way that people involved in these fights get money is they send you things that say your values are under assault and will all be destroyed if the other side wins. And that's what got people back in the day to respond to direct mail, which was like the social media of the time. And if you're in a political fight, if you feel like it's win or lose, you often feel like that justifies anything I want to do because I've got to win this or I will be destroyed or whatever.
Right.
And I think that the school choice debate is like that, like any political debate. But one of the reasons I would like to have widespread school choice and an acceptance by people that that's the way it should be is because I think if we have choice, we have fewer educational decisions being made by government, being made politically, and that can help diffuse our polarization, because I don't feel like, well, if I want my child to learn about the Bible in school and its centrality to history or something like that, that I have to defeat my neighbor politically to do it. And that means I have to demonize them because unfortunately that's the way you win.
All right.
I want to be that, look, freely decide. And if we think something's wrong, we engage in debate in civil society and we persuade people that they're right or wrong, or we don't associate them with them. But we don't say, well, the only solution is I got to get government, which has a monopoly on force, to impose it on you. So I don't like the bomb throwing in any of this. And one of the reasons I like choice is I think it could help in its own sphere reduce some of the vitriol and polarization that is sort of unfortunately a natural part of politics, because you've got to motivate people to be involved, and the way you motivate people to be involved is unfortunately fear. Fear is more powerful emotion than gain. And so we see lots of this appealing to people's fear and anger, and it's where you see, like, on the pro-school choice side, often, I remember, I haven't seen as much recently, but this calling everybody a groomer, or saying you want kids trapped in failed public schools. And nobody wants kids trapped in any failed schools. I don't think the people that they call groomer or groomers, they just say it because they might defend books that are in a library, because they may think that's important. You have lots of different thoughts in the library. So I really wish we could get away from this. I try. I hope I don't engage in it very often. I don't like it on either side. But I also kind of realize that that's kind of the reality of politics, which is why I'd like to get education out of politics as much as possible.
Well, that surfaces one last question, hopefully, and I know we got to end this because it's dragging on. People are probably like, okay, end this if they've not already departed the conversation. But do you have a sense or prediction? If Harris or Trump wins, which one would be better? I hear Trump talk about, like you said, abolishing the Department of Education. I don't tend to think it'll make a big difference one way or the other. I'm sort of consistent with what Rick Hess, how he sort of characterizes it from AEI. And he and I talked on the podcast about that and other things in a previous episode. But, the Project 2025 stuff, of which Trump says he has no knowledge about, and that's clearly not true. But, Heritage Foundation and the motivations and work behind them, and, talking about flamethrowers and bomb throwers and some of the things that I find concerning, the folks like Chris Rufo and the illiberal authoritarianism that I see in the left and right. You mentioned Patrick Deneen and the sort of post-liberal right. That's certainly an issue as concerning as it is on the left, the illiberal authoritarianism. I think the illiberal authoritarianism on the right. Yoram Hazony, I was just reading Conservatism Redefined, and certainly a post-liberal vision there, but especially in terms of education. Do you have a sort of preference for, or do you think one presidential candidate would be better than the other, or is it probably not matter a whole heck of a lot anyways, because education is just something they make passing comments about here and there?
Well, I do think that just based on policy, Trump would probably be better. That is mainly, though, well, because I think we should get rid of the Department of Education, although Rick is right. It's unrealistic to think that we're going to do it.
Right.
And Trump, when he does mention it, makes it sound like he can just snap his finger and do it. And I'd be totally against the president saying, well, I am going to declare this gone.
Right. Because,
again, the Constitution's pretty clear that we have a method for doing that. And law is made in Congress, not by the snap of the finger to presidents. I also don't like that if you read some of Trump's stuff, or I don't think Project 2025 was quite as much about this, but saying, look, we're going to get rid of the Department of Education, but if there's going to be federal money, we're going to use it to punish people who use DEI, have DEI programs, or are woke. And it's like, well, if you don't think the federal government should be involved, you should also be saying the federal government shouldn't be dictating, well, this is acceptable and this isn't. This isn't. So I think he'd be better because his inclination, at least what he says, is to reduce the federal role
today.
But I think what's really important is there are problems in K through 12 education, but they were worse under No Child Left Behind. And we kind of rein that in because I think the country kind of revolted against No Child Left Behind. Mm-hmm. I have more concerns about the Department of Education, actually in higher education, and for the Constitution, because the federal government, people tend to forget, is basically the student lender. It's about 15% of student loans are private, and all the rest is federal. And what we've seen, is repeatedly now in the last couple of years, but with reports going back much further, the federal government, at least in the Department of Education, appears to be incompetent when it comes to administering student loans, even the basics of record keeping. When they were supposed to simplify the FAFSA, that fell apart.
It's gone so well.
Last year's application was a disaster. So they're not only not good at this, but we've seen the Biden administration say he will unilaterally essentially turn loans into grants. And I think that is a big constitutional problem. It's bad policy. And I think the student loans are a bad policy because they fuel inflation in higher ed. But he has been willing to use essentially what he thinks is his own unilateral power to go around Congress. And that's highly problematic. And I don't think Trump would do that. I think Harris would probably try and continue it. So for that reason as well, I think probably Trump would be better, but I can certainly understand why people are concerned about both major candidates.
Yeah, I would echo some of those sort of executive power overreach kind of questions on Trump's behalf as well, and you would probably not vehemently disagree on some of those concerns as well. Neal, it's been a real pleasure to talk. Are there things that we didn't talk about or anything that you want to mention, especially links or anything that you want folks to go to or resources or things that you want them to check out?
Oh, well, thanks. I don't
You've written a few books.
I have to shamelessly self-promote, so
right.
I almost forgot. The first thing I'd say is if you want to learn about Cato, it's just www.cato.org. You can find all our education stuff on there, but Cato is a sort of a national full-service think tank, so there are lots of issues other than education on there. Obviously, education is most important. The best work we do is in education. The smartest people here are in education, but there's a lot of other stuff. And then I should say, so I talk a lot about social cohesion and liberty. I did write a book, it came out a couple of years ago, called The Fractured Schoolhouse, Reexamining Education for a Free, Equal, and Harmonious Society, where I kind of lay out a lot of what I think is the history, the reality of public schooling, and why I think choice would actually lead to greater harmony, would be more respectful of liberty. Anybody who wants to read that because, I don't know, they have trouble getting to sleep at night is welcome to pick that up as well. I'm sure I should promote other things, but I can't think of them right now.
And you call yourself the smartest part of Cato. Geez. We'll make sure to put those links in the show notes. Like I said, I appreciate the conversation time. And as I always say, hopefully folks will find this helpful.
Great. Thank you so much. It was a great conversation.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.